Hitler, Napoleon, and the shadow of history when Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941. He was stepping into one of the most dangerous historical parallels in European military history. Almost exactly 129 years earlier, Napoleon Bonaparte had crossed into Russia with the Grande Armée, only to suffer one of the most catastrophic defeats ever endured by a modern army. Hitler was keenly aware of this comparison. Long before the invasion of the Soviet Union, he displayed a deep fascination with Napoleon, often measuring himself against the great conquerors of Europe. According to his bodyguard Willy Schneider, Hitler privately compared himself not only to Napoleon, but also to Otto von Bismarck, seeing himself as a historical figure destined to reshape Europe. This admiration reached its emotional peak in 1940 after the fall of France, when Hitler visited Paris and stood before Napoleon's tomb at Les Invalides, reportedly calling it the proudest moment of his life. Yet admiration quickly turned into anxiety once plans for invading the Soviet Union began. The Nazi leadership understood that Napoleon's 1812 invasion symbolized the ultimate warning. Russia could destroy even the greatest military power. As planning intensified, officials deliberately avoided public comparisons to Napoleon, fearing that historical memory might undermine confidence in the campaign. Still, the ghost of 1812 refused to disappear. Deep within Hitler's inner circle, there was an unspoken awareness that Germany was about to test the same limits that had shattered Napoleon's empire. Operation Barbarossa was not just a military gamble, it was an attempt to defy what many believed were the unforgiving laws of history. Fear, denial, and Nazi leadership before Barbarossa as the invasion of the Soviet Union approached. Anxiety about Napoleon's fate surfaced repeatedly among Germany's military and political leadership. In March 1941, General Gotthard Heinrici, who would later command defensive operations during the Battle of Berlin, openly remarked that history seemed to dictate a grim pattern. Conflict with Britain inevitably led continental powers down the road to Moscow, just as it had for Napoleon. These concerns were especially visible in the private writings of Joseph Goebbels, whose diary reveals both fear and forced optimism. Goebbels clearly understood the psychological danger of the comparison. Even before the invasion began, he was preparing propaganda strategies to counter inevitable references to Napoleon's failed campaign. Publicly, Nazi ideology framed the war as a crusade against Bolshevism, claiming this ideological mission alone would overcome historical precedent. Privately, however, Goebbels struggled with doubt. Just days before the invasion, he attempted to reassure himself, insisting that Germany's modern, mechanized forces would prevent history from repeating itself. Tanks, motorized divisions, and aircraft, he believed, made Germany fundamentally different from Napoleon's army. This confidence was shared by foreign allies, including Ion Antonescu, who dismissed comparisons with 1812 as irrelevant. Yet this belief ignored a critical reality. Despite its modern image, the German army still relied heavily on horses and outdated logistics. Beneath the surface confidence, Nazi leaders sensed the weight of historical inevitability pressing down on their plans. Their denial was not ignorance, it was a conscious attempt to outrun the past. Strategy, Moscow, and the fear of repeating 1812 once Operation Barbarossa began. Historical memory quietly shaped German strategy. Unlike Napoleon, who had driven relentlessly toward Moscow, Hitler approved a plan involving three major thrusts into the Soviet Union rather than a single concentrated advance. While this decision was influenced by economic goals and military logistics, psychological factors also played a role. General Alfred Jodl later suggested that Hitler had an instinctive aversion to repeating Napoleon's march on Moscow. This fear was deeply personal. Hitler frequently referenced Napoleon in private conversations, sometimes projecting the French emperor's fate onto Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, claiming Stalin not Germany would suffer the same downfall. Historians interpret these statements as evidence of underlying uncertainty. As German forces advanced rapidly during the summer of 1941, confidence returned, and comparisons with 1812 temporarily faded. Yet this confidence rested on fragile assumptions that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly, that supply lines could be maintained, and that winter would not matter. All of these assumptions mirrored Napoleon's miscalculations. By autumn, as German momentum slowed and Moscow remained out of reach, the echoes of 1812 grew louder. The specter of Napoleon was no longer theoretical, it was becoming operational reality. Winter, retreat, and Hitler's obsession with Napoleon. The winter crisis of 1941-1942 marked the moment when Napoleon's shadow fully returned. As Soviet counteroffensives battered German forces outside Moscow, many commanders urged retreat to avoid encirclement and destruction. Hitler refused. His reasoning was explicitly historical. In a message to Army Group Center in December 1941, he warned that discussion of retreat risked repeating Napoleon's catastrophic withdrawal from Russia. To Hitler, retreat meant annihilation. Holding ground even under horrific conditions seemed preferable to reliving 1812. Months later, He bluntly told a general that retreat would have sealed Germany's fate just as it had Napoleon's. This belief hardened into obsession. Ironically, by refusing tactical withdrawals, Hitler often worsened German losses. The Wehrmacht endured freezing temperatures, supply breakdowns, and mounting casualties conditions, strikingly similar to those that destroyed the Grande Armée. Hitler's fixation on Napoleon blinded him to the differences between symbolic history and operational reality. His fear of repeating history ultimately caused him to reenact it in another form. Napoleon, as propaganda and national myth. As the war turned decisively against Germany, the Nazi regime began using the Napoleonic era not as a warning, but as inspiration. The memory of the German wars of liberation against Napoleon in 1813 was revived to mobilize a population facing defeat. In his infamous Total War speech at the Berlin Sportpalast in February 1943, Goebbels closed with a line from a patriotic poem originally written to rally Germans against Napoleon. The message was clear. Just as Germans had once risen against a foreign conqueror, they must now rise again. This historical framing intensified as Allied and Soviet forces closed in. Goebbels lamented that Hitler lacked generals like Gerhard von Scharnhorst or August von Gneisenau, reformers who had defeated Napoleon. History was no longer a cautionary tale, it was a desperate source of hope. Kohlberg Volksturm, and the final irony in the final year of the war. Nazi propaganda fully embraced Napoleonic symbolism. The film Kohlberg depicted a heroic civilian uprising against Napoleon's forces, mirroring Germany's call for total national resistance. At the same time, the regime created the Volkssturm, a desperate militia composed of elderly men and teenage boys. Symbolically, the Volkssturm was established on October 18, 1944, the anniversary of Napoleon's defeat at the Battle of Leipzig. The irony was devastating. What had once been a story of national rebirth became a symbol of collapse. Hitler had spent years trying to avoid Napoleon's fate, yet in the end, his war mirrored it in nearly every way. Operation Barbarossa proved that history does not repeat mechanically, but it does punish those who ignore its lessons. The Nazi leadership studied Napoleon, feared him, denied him, and finally invoked him. And in doing so, they confirmed the very historical patterns they had tried so desperately to escape.